I'm Hillary Hayden. I'm the organizing director at the Trade Justice Education Fund, and we are a national organization working to stop the damage of corporate-centered trade deals and promote a positive vision for international trade. These Trade Justice Power Hour calls happen every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern, and they cover a wide range of educational topics about trade policy that will be relevant and interesting to trade activists across the country. I do want to flag quickly that these calls are not intended as press briefings. So if you're a member of the press and you've got questions, I am more than happy to talk with you. But please feel free to reach out to me separately. This is not the place for those press questions. Over the next hour, we're going to focus on a really popular topic that our staff get asked about a lot, which is investor state dispute settlement, which goes by the acronym ISDS. As our speaker today is going to detail for us, ISDS is a mechanism that's written into a lot of trade and investment agreements that allows individual corporations to challenge laws, regulations, permitting decisions, and even some court decisions that they view as a violation of their supposed trade agreement rights. These ISDS challenges are not heard in the U.S. court system or any other country's domestic court system, but instead they're heard in front of an extrajudicial tribunal of often 3 corporate trade attorneys. Now, these tribunals can't literally overturn a country's laws and other decisions, but they can award companies millions and sometimes even billions of dollars in taxpayer compensation, such that if a country doesn't want to face additional lawsuits, they change their policies and get in line. Folks who attend these calls regularly will remember earlier this year hearing about the Ruby River ISDS case and accompanying actions at Ruby River offices across North America. In that case, Ruby River Capital sued Canada for $20 billion, the largest ISDS case to date, over canceling permits for a proposed LNG facility at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. This is just one example of the threat that ISDS poses to climate action. Today, we're going to hear about a great new report that was put out by Sierra Club titled Trading Away Our Climate, How Corporations Use Trade and Investment Agreements to Undermine Action on Climate Change. And by way of an agenda, in a minute, like I said, I'm going to pass off that mic to Iliana from Sierra Club to talk about their report. After Iliana's comments, we are going to have time for some of your questions. So please put those questions in the Q&A feature as we go along. And we're going to get to as many of those questions as we can in the Q&A. Then I'm going to share some action steps that folks can take in the coming weeks to push forward this conversation about eliminating ISDS. And then after that, we are going to hear a little bit from Trade Justice's director, Arthur Stamoulis, for a quick update on President Biden's recent tariff announcement and some related actions that we would love everyone here's help with. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to you, Iliana. Thank you so much. We're excited to hear about the report.
Thank you, Hillary. I'm happy to be here. Let's launch the screen. So hi, everyone. My name is Iliana Paul. I am the Deputy Director of the Industrial Transformation campaign at the Sierra Club. And I'm going to be talking about a report that we released a few weeks ago, Trading Away Our Climate. Hillary did an excellent job of explaining ISDS, but I really want to dig into sort of why ISDS is such a threat for climate action. There we go. So here's a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. Please, if you do have questions, pop them in the Q&A. I'm going to struggle to look at the chat at the same time. So if you have any clarifying questions, I will try to get to them later, unless Hillary pings me and jumps in and says that I need to respond to something now. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is why does trade matter for climate action? Briefly talk about ISDS. I know, Hillary again gave a great overview on that, but a couple more thoughts on kind of the different pieces of ISDS and who benefits. I'm going to go over a couple of cases of fossil fuel corporations using ISDS, recommendations that we have in the report for how to end ISDS, and then I want to just talk really briefly about a climate peace clause, which we see as a related, complementary, necessary trade reform to go along. And then I would love to hear your questions. So the reason that trade and climate action really need to be thought of together, or the reason that climate action really needs to have a trade component, is because the existing trade regime has really created a race to the bottom. where we have basically goods being produced around the world where there are lower environmental, labor, and human rights standards, which in some ways are intentionally lower to attract investors. So basically that means that dirty goods are cheaper to produce and then they're cheaper in the global market, and countries with higher standards lose out. But under a climate-friendly trade regime, we basically are going to flip that on its head. We want to see new rules that promote environmental safeguards around the world. We want incentives for countries to produce more cleanly, which could be like in the form of domestic policies that we would like to not see challenged by other both by other states and by corporations. So that's both the ISDS piece and the Climate Peace Clause piece. And then also part of that is protecting the clean energy investments that the US and other countries are making. So the way that we make goods really matters, and the way that we trade goods, or the rules around trade, really shape how we do that production. And there are lots of ways to make it more climate friendly, to make it more labor friendly, respectful of human rights, et cetera. And eliminating ISDS is just a small piece of that. So ISDS, investor state dispute settlement, is a really one-sided set of protections that allow private actors like corporations to sue governments for what are often millions, if not billions of dollars, when an investment frankly doesn't pan out. And as anyone here who owns a few stocks knows, the investor is typically the one who takes on the risk, right? So if I buy 3 shares of Q-Cells stock, for example, that's a solar manufacturer, and the company goes belly up, I lose my money. It was my risk that I took. And it's right that I, as the investor, lose my money. In the ISDS system, corporations believe that they can make an investment, like plan to build a pipeline in the country. And when the circumstances change, they get to take the taxpayers' money rather than forfeiting their own money. So it's basically a system in which companies like large fossil fuel corporations can bully governments and their citizens. And it's a feature really that's built into free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties. And there's 3 terms, and this is a little in the weeds, but it'll come up later, that kind of enshrine the investor protections that make up ISDS. The first 2 are minimum standard of treatment and fair and equitable treatment. And basically what that means is that corporations have a right to a predictable business environment. But that implies basically that laws never change, that rules never change, that there's never updated information on which we make these decisions. And so it's fairly unrealistic. And then indirect expropriation, in most cases, like in domestic cases, expropriation only counts or only is an issue when a government actually seizes property. But in ISDS cases, typically indirect expropriation is invoked when there's basically a loss of future profits. So if a project basically can't be completed because a government changes a policy, they will claim indirect expropriation. So again, basically all of these claims are corporations have these privileges, these protections under trade arrangements, trade pacts, that governments don't have. It's very, like I said, very one-sided. And then often kind of these protections are used very liberally in a very broad sense, so that there's broad grounds on which for corporations to sue governments. So in the report, we go through several ISDS cases from fossil fuel corporations. I think sort of an important piece of scene setting is that fossil fuel corporations are responsible for something like 20% of all ISDS cases. And typically the awards in fossil fuel cases is many times more the average ISDS award. So I think it really goes to show that like we know in the US with domestic policy, the fossil fuel industry is super strong. They have had a hugely successful disinformation campaign that continues to make climate action political, like a politically charged issue. And it's no different for sort of the way that climate action is panning out around the world. And so we thought having some sort of illustrative cases would be helpful in showing people just exactly the kind of latitude that these companies expect. So the first one I like to talk about because I think it's such a symbolic fight in the US. So folks might remember, like around 2015, the fight against the Keystone XL pipeline was really peaking. That was a pipeline going to be built to deliver dirty Canadian tar sands oil through the US down to the Gulf of Mexico. And there was a huge movement against it, sort of like a divestment. I think that the divestment movement really became big then in the climate space, and also like the chance of keep it in the ground. And because of all of this, in part because of all of this public pressure, President Obama canceled the permit for the pipeline. And so then TransCanada, the owner operator of the pipeline, sued the US under NAFTA for $15 billion, claiming lost profits, among other things. Trump then reinstated the pipeline in 2017, I think via presidential permit. And then as soon as Biden took office, it was one of the early actions he took in 2021 was revoking the presidential permit for the Keystone pipeline. So basically the ISDS case ended when Trump reinstated the permit. Then it restarted when Biden revoked the permit again. TC Energy, TransCanada became TC Energy in that time. They're still claiming at least $15 billion, but it's $15 billion plus fees and interest. So it could be even more than that. The case is still pending, but obviously it would be a big deal for TC Energy to be able to get away with $15 billion of US taxpayer money, simply because we realized that it was not aligned with our commitments under the Paris Accord, not aligned with the climate science, and not aligned with the well-being of so many folks, including Black and Brown communities and Indigenous folks living in the path of the pipeline to build it. Another case that is interesting because it actually didn't, the company didn't get an award, but I think sort of the result is still interesting. Lone Pine is an American fossil fuel company in, now I don't have my dates in front of me, I think 2011, Quebec, the government of Quebec passed a fracking moratorium under the St. Lawrence River after due deliberation, a number of studies. This particular decision came after one particular study, but that study was on the heels of numerous studies basically showing that fracking was not safe, responsible, healthy for the biosphere and the human environment. So all of the mining permits to LNG companies got revoked. Lone Pine decided to launch an ISDS case against the government of Quebec. And what is interesting is Lone Pine claimed all of these, I'm gonna go back to this earlier slide, but claimed basically breach of all of these protections, minimum standard treatment, fair and equitable treatment, and indirect expropriation. And analysis shows that basically if the fracking ban had been wider, if it had been a countrywide ban or a provincial ban, likely the challenge would have succeeded. So it sets a really dangerous precedent in terms of like what types of decisions, what types of policies companies get to make ISDS claims about. And again, in both cases, there was really good evidence, in addition to public opinion, showing that we needed to stop these fossil fuel projects. And in one case, you know, TC Energy might be successful, we'll see. In the Lone Pine case, again, it sets the stage for another company to basically file an ISDS suit over the same things and be successful. So, you know, as we all know, we need every tool at our disposal to fight ISDS or to fight climate change, also to fight ISDS, but we really need all the tools in the tool belt to stop climate change. And building out fossil fuel infrastructure, we know is not compatible with a stable climate. But time and time again, fossil fuel corporations are using these outdated trade rules to take advantage of governments, to take taxpayer money, to push back on policies possibly one of the most dangerous effects of ISDS is that countries actually walk back their decisions, their permitting decisions, so something like canceling the Keystone Pipeline, something like a fracking moratorium. And that would really spell disaster for climate action if none of those policies went forward. This is just another way that the fossil fuel industry operates perniciously around the world. And we really need to make sure that they can no longer take advantage of trade rules in order to do this. So in the report, we go through a few recommendations, which I'll just really briefly summarize here. The first one, stop the expansion of ISDS. No more new agreements. No more new agreements with ISDS that protect corporate interests over people and the planet. President Biden has committed to this, and we would like to see that commitment carried forward. We know there was just an article in Inside US Trade where we know business interests are really pushing the Biden administration to include ISDS provisions, to include investor protections in upcoming agreements, and we can't let that happen. I've talked a lot about why ISDS is bad for the climate, and you all, I think, are a group of folks who is more read into this issue than others, but there can be ISDS claims about all sorts of public interest policies. So it's not just bad for the environment, it's bad for human rights, it's bad for labor rights, it's bad for government's own sovereignty, the ability of a government to kind of make its own decisions for its people. So we need to eliminate all ISDS, not just any ISDS that has to do with fossil fuel companies or climate policies. And then we need to also eliminate ISDS from existing agreements. So there are free trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties, BITs, bilateral investment treaties, typically just enshrine investor protections. So to the extent that that is true, eliminating those BITs, removing ISDS from existing FTAs and BITs, and then also possibly withdrawing consent. So that can happen sort of like as a side letter, two countries get together or a block of countries get together and they write a letter saying like, we withdraw our consent to arbitration. So we don't agree to participate in this scheme for corporate profiteering. So luckily there is a path forward. Luckily, it seems like the public opinion, civil society is really wanting to push on this issue and make ISDS, raise the profile of ISDS so that our leaders will take the steps that we've outlined here. And we're already seeing some good progress. So I think that, we just have to keep up the fight and keep up the pressure. The one other thing I want to talk about briefly, and I am showing here a little thumbnail of a paper we did with Sierra Club and TJEF did together. But we think of a climate peace clause as sort of like the government to government counterpart to ISDS. It's not exactly the same, but in ISDS, we have corporations challenging government's policies, decisions, permitting, et cetera. In state-to-state dispute settlement, which is what a climate peace clause would address, you have countries attacking other countries' decisions. And this can create a really hostile environment for climate action as well. So, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act has come under attack from numerous other countries. And basically what can happen is what you call like a cooling effect. But if countries are afraid that they will be threatened or there will be a suit with the WTO over a domestic climate policy, a green jobs policy, they might not pursue it in the first place. So a climate peace clause basically makes a carve out in the state-to-state dispute settlement case or space for climate action in particular, so that there doesn't have to be fear both basically. So if we eliminate ISDS, we have a climate peace clause, then governments can really lean into climate ambition more than sort of current trade rules allow them to. And it's a really sort of important, so anyways, I just wanted to kind of one, share this work that we did together, and two, flag that, there are a number of trade policies that we need to pursue in addition to eliminating ISDS that will create a more climate friendly trade regime. And the climate peace clause is one of them. So with that, I would love to hear your questions. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Iliana. I do want to encourage folks to put those questions in the Q&A. We're going to get to as many of those as we can. I do want to start and just jump in a little bit on the peace clause bit, Iliana. Do you I know this is putting you on the spot a little bit, but do you have a little bit of background about where that came from? Because a lot of folks on this call probably have been hearing about ISDS since like NAFTA, right? But I think the climate peace clause is like maybe a 2-year old concept. Do you want to offer
Yeah.
a background about it?
Yeah, so yeah, I think climate peace clause is and Arthur actually I'm sure knows this much better than I do, but is a newer concept, but it is not totally novel. It's based off of a peace clause that was designed for food security. So even though putting it in the climate context is fairly new, it's not something that would be like totally out there or like totally random to other countries. It's like a known sort of like a known practice to put in place when there is a global emergency like climate change. So yeah, while the climate peace clause is a newer, and we'll do a, if you haven't done a session on that, maybe we can do one. But yeah, so it's like using an existing tool that is itself isn't that old, I don't think, but again, Arthur would know better. For again, to just like make sure that we can ramp up ambition on climate action and not feel held back.
No, I think that's super helpful, Ileana. We talk a lot at Trade Justice about, you know, the systems underneath ISDS have kind of been unraveling in different ways. We did a whole conversation on some stuff going on in Honduras and some stuff going on in the EU a couple of months ago with Melanie Foley. And I think the other, you know, the climate peace clause, as you're saying, does really look at the other conversation, right? Not the corporations attacking government's laws, but governments attacking other governments' laws. And that is kind of a trade area in terms of climate related work that is still going to need a lot of work in the coming years. Not that ISDS is not, but this is kind of a looming battle, I think.
Yes, absolutely. I think,
folks.
and I think that the attacks against the Inflation Reduction Act really show what if we're going to pursue further investment policies, clean jobs policies, we might be seeing again and again instances in which if we had a climate peace clause, we could move forward without sort of like fear of reprisal.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's super helpful. Ileana, there's a question in the chat about whether or not a climate peace clause would help address any kind of resource extraction. I don't know if there's anything there that you want to jump in on.
You know, I think not necessary. Okay, yeah, I think possibly. You were, and if people have, I added climate peace clause on the last slide, and people are interested, and I should have prepped more to talk about it. You know, I think that it depends on sort of like what policy was causing the resource extraction. I think maybe in like the instance of like a nationalized industry, there might be sort of like something more there. But in my mind, the ISDS is a bigger piece of the resource extraction puzzle when you're talking about private corporations.
That's super helpful. I also want to encourage April to check out our Trade Justice Power Hour on the critical minerals agreement stuff, because that's also really in the vein of resource extraction. We just did a call on that last month, and I can reach out also with the link.
Yeah, and I'll just, oh, sorry, can I just add the article, the inside trade article that I mentioned before, where just like this past few days, business interests are saying that we need to include investor protections, we need ISDS for Biden's trade agenda, talked about specifically about critical minerals agreements.
I will definitely be sharing links in the chat here to this report and to the other resources that we're talking about in just a second when we get to some action steps. Ileana, one question I always get is, are we going to get access to folks' slides, like any version of folks' slides? Would you be comfortable with that?
Yes, happy to share my slides.
Awesome. Thank you. There's also a question here in the Q&A. Honestly, just talking a lot about supply chains and the basically the expense on the environment of us like shipping goods back and forth, of supply chains being globalized. I wonder, Iliana, if there's anything that you would want to jump in on there, just in terms of conversations about shipping goods around the world and the cost to the climate in that space.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think Arthur might get to this a little bit when he talks about the recent tariff announcements. But um, we certainly at Sierra Club, part of what my team works on, maybe for some context, is clean manufacturing, and is clean American manufacturing, just because that's our policy space, as we work on US policy. And so we see trade and sort of changing trade rules as a really important piece of the puzzle in terms of not just shipping emissions, but also like having clean, resilient, responsible supply chains. So to the extent that, let's say, the US has better environmental standards for producing a certain good, better labor standards, better human rights standards, can we build up that industry, that supply chain domestically? It doesn't mean that we shouldn't ever be trading. I think we all know, or trade is premised on the idea of having different countries having comparative advantage, but we never want that comparative advantage to be we have the lowest environmental standards and the lowest labor standards, and we walk all over human rights, right? That should never be the comparative advantage. So I think I think that there is actually a lot to be said for championing, responsible, high labor standard, high environmental standard supply chains, which may include like building up, industry in the U.S.
That's really helpful. I also wanted to just address the conversation a little bit about Trump and the TPP. So it's true that Trump did withdraw us from the TPP on day one, but I like to say in these spaces that if the votes had been there to pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the lame duck session between the election and when Trump took office, like they would have pushed forward with it. The problem is that the votes weren't there for the TPP. And so I think the the conversation around that is especially important. And I think the other piece of the question, as Andy's flagging for us in the chat, is really around what should green-minded lefty folks do about this when it feels to them like Trump was doing more to address trade than the Biden administration. I have some answers to that question as well, but curious if you have any.
Well, I would love to hear your answers. The one thing I'll say is, we've now had two administrations, the Trump administration and the Biden administration, saying that we need to end ISDS. So, it is definitely not the case that Democrats are always the first ones to say the right thing about trade, or the only ones who know the right thing about trade. I will say that, I think the motivations can be quite different. And to the extent that that matters, it matters. And to the extent that it doesn't, it doesn't. But Hillary, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Totally. So, a few things I'd like to say on this. I shared kind of the notion in the post that there are some Democrats that really like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and are really pro free trade. But I think that all of the years of trade organizing and also this kind of open conversation around what Trump did or did not do effectively on trade has created this moment where I think a lot of Democrats are talking about what we need to do differently on trade. The other thing that I wanted to note in this space is that trade justice has also been doing some what we're kind of branding as countering nationalism related work, and just talking, as you were saying, Iliana, about some of the motivations, right, behind why we're pushing forward with specific policies. Is maybe racism or nationalism like the driving force behind those policies, or is it labor rights? And having good standards behind our supply chains, having good climate standards behind our supply chains, looking at human rights, those kinds of things. What are the motivations for those policies? And knowing that those specific things are going to be the motivation for the policies. What should those policies look like, and what should they be targeting versus, we could like pick any random bingo board phrase that Trump used during many of his conversations about trade. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I'll say just quickly here that I feel like we have gotten a lot more opportunities, I guess, to weigh in, to give feedback, those kinds of things over the last several years. And I think it's been really good to see the Biden administration engage with civil society in that way, in a way where we've been able to give feedback, where they're seeking actual input on trade policies and that kind of thing. So, see a couple other questions. Sorry, folks, I'm having a hard time talking and keeping up with the the chat and the Q&A. Okay, yeah. So here, this one's to you, Iliana, and it sounds like we should definitely do a separate Trade Justice Power Hour on the the peace clause, because a lot of folks are really digging in on that. Does the climate peace clause have any potential for opposing the generation of greenhouse gases or other environmentally harmful impacts caused by trade or other business activities?
That is a good question. The way that we've conceptualized and thought about the design of the climate peace clause is that it is very specific to mitigating climate change and green jobs policies. So any sort of like build out of the clean energy economy. Obviously, in many instances, changes that we make, especially to the way we produce goods, that reduce greenhouse gas emissions also reduce co-pollutants. That is actually like my, something at Sierra Club that we think a lot about is making sure that there isn't like this climate myopia, but that folks, especially in the sort of talking about the manufacturing space, the industrial space, that folks are really thinking about the local health impacts of these facilities, the air pollution, the water pollution, that comes out of them, and not just the greenhouse gas emissions. So luckily, there are a lot of changes that kind of handle both things. I think it would be challenging to design a peace clause that was for environmental protection writ large, but I actually probably think there's some ways that you could do it. Maybe that's a project for another day. But I think in theory, it's really good. It would be good to not just be limited to climate change and think about like all of the domestic policies that we want to pursue to protect our communities, protect our workers, protect our air, land, and water. How do we make sure that those policies stay in place and kind of aren't overturned by some outdated trade rules? So yeah, it's a good question. I just don't have a concrete answer.
I really appreciate you taking on so many questions, Iliana. I know there's been a lot, especially about the climate peace clause, which was not the main topic of our power hour, but really appreciate you fielding those questions. I think we're going to leave our conversation about ISDS here and turn to a few action steps that folks can take. I'll flag again here that there's been so much really good work over the last several years, and even just in the last few months, to raise the profile of this issue. So much so, as Iliana noted, that when President Biden came into office, he has largely opposed ISDS. He has opposed ISDS and new agreements. The Trump administration also took, a different stance on ISDS than we have seen from prior administrations. We've talked a lot on these calls about congressional letters that have been put out on this issue, and letters from law and econ professors. Additionally, in the last month or so, our friends at Global Trade Watch put out a report on the impacts of ISDS on Indigenous communities around the world, which is also worth taking a look at. While President Biden has been on the right side of this issue, corporations do continue pushing back on that policy stance, no matter who's in office. They're really pushing back, claiming that, as Iliana was mentioning, that these like investor rights are really important to them. And there's a letter, I think, that even went in this morning. I got sent something about it, like literally like 10 minutes before this call, just talking about how important ISDS and other investor protections are to the business community. So it's really important, as President Biden continues trade negotiations with Kenya and trade negotiations with Latin America and being part of these other conversations, that we in civil society continue to voice that we do not want to see agreements that have ISDS in them. So the first and most obvious thing I want to ask folks to do today is share that report that Iliana has been detailing for us. I know Clayton's going to drop links in the chat in a second. I want to encourage folks to share that on social media. Please share that report with groups you work with, on listservs where folks might be interested. Just keep spreading the word about the issue, because we really need to keep elevating the profile of this issue with the Biden administration in this moment where there's this kind of tug of war, right, over the future of it. Aside from sharing that report, Again, in conjunction with partners at Global Trade Watch, we've been working on getting state legislators all across the country to sign a letter urging President Biden to remove ISDS from trade and investment agreements. Again, folks that attend these calls regularly will remember that many members of Congress in the House and the Senate have sent letters this year as well. And getting our state legislators speaking out about this issue will put even more pressure on Biden to work toward eliminating ISDS from all our trade and investment agreements rather than just, not including it in the new ones that we have. If you have not sent a letter to your state legislator yet, please do so through that Action Network link that Clayton just put in the chat. And for folks who are wondering, I will be 100% sure that all these links end up in your email inbox with a recording of this call tomorrow. Can we get one more quick thanks to Iliana for all of her work and for sharing about the report? Iliana, we appreciate you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I want to turn quickly to another topic of conversation in trade policy from the last couple of weeks. So folks here might have seen Biden's announcement on tariffs, and we wanted to be sure to talk about it a little bit here. So Arthur's going to talk about the announcement, and after his comments, we'll have time for some questions again. So please put those in the Q&A as they come up for you, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Arthur, do you want to take it from here?
Yep. Thanks, Hillary, and thanks everyone for being here. Before I jump into the tariff news, let me just say a couple quick things on ISDS. I mean, first off, please do read that report. Iliana and the team at the Sierra Club just do an excellent job there, as we just heard, laying out how ISDS remains a significant threat to climate action. We heard about the Climate Peace Clause. It's just a great tool. And I think one of the other things I want to say is a lot of us older folks have been outraged by and working on ISDS for literally decades now. And as Iliana and Hillary have both alluded, right now we actually have an opportunity to eliminate ISDS, to eliminate the threat ISDS poses to climate action, and to a host of other public interest policies. We've got an administration that opposes ISDS. We've got pending trade talks across the Americas in which ISDS is going to be discussed. If we're able to get policymakers to prioritize this issue, this is our chance to do away with ISDS in a really decisive way. There's a reason why Sierra Club's talking about this now, and our friends at Public Citizen are talking about it now, and Rethink Trade has a new report on it, and our friends in the faith community are mobilizing on this issue now, and that's because we have an opportunity now to do something about ISDS. So I encourage you all to please take those actions. I am actually here to ask for your help on another issue though, and that's voicing support for increased tariffs on unfair imports. It didn't get a whole lot of attention, but as Hillary said, a few weeks back, the Biden administration finished a mandated review of existing tariffs, and it found that there were some pretty significant loopholes in the tariffs regime that was put in place by previous administrations. And specifically what the Biden administration has proposed is raising tariffs in a handful of particular industries that are crucial to the clean energy transition and that are increasingly being monopolized by unfair practices overseas, including through practices like sweatshop labor and even forced labor. So the planned tariff increases are on products like semiconductors, solar panels, long storage batteries, electric vehicles. These are industries that are critical for creating good paying union wage manufacturing jobs in the United States and frankly around the world. So this is very much a jobs and wages issues. But it's not just a jobs and wages issue. Preventing monopolization in these industries, ensuring that multiple regions throughout the world are able to manufacture these types of products, not just one region. It's also crucial to preventing monopoly pricing and to preventing monopoly supply chain disruptions. So that's important for consumers, and it's also important for speeding the clean energy transition. I'll say naturally, corporations who profit from importing sweatshop labor and forced labor products, selling them here at a markup, of course, they're livid about these tariff increases. They want to be able to continue offshoring jobs, continue monopolizing industries with impunity, regardless of the impact on workers, on consumers, on the environment. And what these so what we need to do is come together, again, and say, no, like, sorry, corporations, these tariffs are good for working people by helping counter monopolies. They're good for consumers. They're good for the environment. This is something we're backing the Biden administration on. And so the easiest opportunity we have to voice our support for the Biden tariffs right now is via an open public comment period that's open now through June 28th. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative is actually taking official comments on the tariffs and on the tariff implementation plan. So we've created a web form that lets people submit template comments in support of the tariffs, in support of the administration's plan to adopt them rapidly. And I believe Clayton's posting a link to that web tool in the chat. And unless you're driving or something, I ask that everyone please take a second right now to click on that link in the chat and submit comments in support of the Biden tariffs. It's only going to take a second. Actually taking the action is more important than hearing my thoughts on the issue. So I encourage you, if you haven't already, click that link now. And while you're doing that, I'll mention, like, these tariff increases are supported by the AFL-CIO, the Carpenters Union, the UAW, the Teamsters, the Machinists, the Steelworkers, and also by groups like the Sierra Club, the Blue Green Alliance, the solar manufacturers, a lot of others. So again, like, personally, please take a second, and if you haven't yet, sign on to comments voicing your support. And then beyond that, if you represent an organization, I urge you to please also send an email about the tariffs comment period to your email list, just encouraging your members to submit comments too. I think in a follow-up email to this meeting, either later today or tomorrow, you're going to receive links to a toolkit with a template email blast, template social media language, like everything you need to help notify folks about the comment period and encourage them to take action. So if you have access to your group's email list, please email your members about this. Like, even if you don't have access to an organizational email list, you're probably on listservs that you can post to as an individual. You're probably on social media individually, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. Please, use the tools that are going to be provided and help spread the word. Because the corporate media, like, unless they're lambasting tariffs as a violation of so-called free trade, they're not talking about these tariffs. Like, we need to get the word out about them and get our friends and colleagues to help defend them. So that's my main ask for today, and I'm happy to take any questions about that, Hillary.
Awesome. Thank you, Arthur. There are a couple questions. So the first one that I wanted to ask you to address is we understand the idea behind tariffs, but what do you think about whether or not they increase inflation?
Yeah, no, thanks for thanks for that question. This is something that we hear all the time, right? That if we increase tariffs, and by extension, if we don't allow goods made with forced labor and sweatshop labor to enter the country freely, isn't that going to increase prices? And I'd say, like, in a perfect world, the answer would be, so what? We're against forced labor, we're against sweatshop labor. Like, we don't care if it costs a little more money to treat people fairly. And if you look at polling on the subject, most Americans actually agree with that. But beyond that, the truth of the matter is these tariffs are not expected to increase prices. Over the long haul, they're actually designed to decrease prices, to reduce prices. I'll say we obviously don't have data on these exact tariffs yet because they've just been proposed. They're not implemented yet. But if you look at the Trump tariffs on Chinese imports, which the corporate media went completely batshit over, those tariffs have been in place long enough to have been studied. And what the data shows there is that there's absolutely no correlation between tariffs and inflation. And I think if you think about the inflation that people are facing today, It's a largely in things like groceries, like rent, maybe fuel costs, medicine costs. It's not as much on things that face tariffs. And in many cases, not even things that are even imported, like your rent, most of your groceries are not imports. And what the Biden tariffs are trying to accomplish, and particularly like when you think of them in conjunction with other initiatives like the CHIPS Act, like the Inflation Reduction Act, which are making these big investments in new semiconductor and clean energy technology manufacturing. What these programs are trying to accomplish is preventing the monopolization of these sectors. And that's what we need to prevent price hikes over the long haul. And I'll say it's also needed to prevent supply chain disruptions. When you allow production to be concentrated in one region or one country, or sometimes even one factory, that concentrated production becomes incredibly vulnerable to things like pandemics, like we saw during COVID-19. It's incredibly vulnerable to severe weather events like floods, heat wave related brownouts, which we're going to see more and more often due to climate change. And that concentrated production is also like really vulnerable to geopolitical conflicts. So for instance, when the Chinese government threatened to cut off exports of solar panels to the United States, when US officials brought up China's treatment of religious and ethnic minorities. It may seem counterintuitive in some ways, but when applied in a smart and strategic manner, tariffs are actually a good tool for lowering prices, for strengthening supply chains.
I think that's super helpful, Arthur. There's another question in the chat, and I think there's a little bit of maybe subtext here, but the question in the chat is what kind of WTO rules address tariffs? And the thing that I'll kind of tack onto that is we saw a lot of like random tariff challenges at the WTO over the last few years. Do you expect any of that over these tariffs?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. WTO rules do set like minimum or rather maximum tariff levels that countries that are party to the WTO are expected to use with one another. That said, there are some exceptions built in there for a number of reasons, and frankly, the US, multiple administrations have been willing to sort of push the envelope on those rules, try to expand the definition of those rules to really make sure that, again, this monopolization of strategic industries like clean vehicles, like solar panels, like semiconductors doesn't continue. So there might be WTO challenges. We'll have to see how that shakes out.
Super helpful. I think that we got to most of the questions. So I think we're going to leave that conversation here. I want to thank you so much, Arthur, for sharing about that announcement. I know that there are folks that have been reaching out asking me questions about it and that kind of thing. So it's good to have a space to address it. Want to also give one more thank you to Iliana for coming to share about the ISDS report. Really appreciate you both for taking time to get us up to speed about these things. I want to thank folks for joining, and I want to reiterate that I'll be in touch soon with a follow-up email with all the tariff links that we discussed and all the various asks around the ISDS report and state legislators letter as well. Yeah, I'll be in touch with that hopefully tomorrow. Thanks again for attending and we'll be in touch. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.